Welcome to part 2. As you can see, I have a different shirt and a neater beard this time, and you never know, I might even crack a smile at some point in the next 25 minutes, but I can't guarantee it. Okay, on with part 2. In the UK, adulthood starts when you reach 18. And it's at this age that many Britons begin higher education. These days, around half of 18-year-olds go to university. A generation ago, however, in 1990, only around 1 in 5 did. This latter proportion is significant because most of our cabinet members and BBC journalists reached adulthood during the 80s and the 90s. If they reflected the British population at the time, then only around 10 of the 52 would be university graduates. But again, as with secondary schooling, these two groups stand apart from the general public. All 26 of the BBC sample and at least 22 cabinet members, that's 85%, went to university. These are clearly much higher participation rates than for the UK as a whole. To reiterate, most of these 48 people reached adulthood a generation ago, when only 1 in 5 Britons went to university. In recent years, however, higher education has become more accessible and more inclusive than ever before. Some say that it's been democratised. Even so, there are still considerable differences in participation, and again, it helps to be born to a middle-class family. Only 1/3 of teenagers from average income families attend university, compared with 3/4 in the highest decile of the earnings table. While it's clearly important to the general public that cabinet members and senior journalists are smart people, the data strongly suggests that those smart people who don't take the university route, typically from working class families, are automatically excluded from these occupations. What's more, those who do embark on an undergraduate course can expect to leave with a debt in excess of £50,000. This puts the offspring of lower income families at a further disadvantage, which is compounded when you consider that unpaid internships, sometimes protracted, are an essential step in the career building process, especially in journalism. Once again, life is much easier if you have relatively wealthy parents. In total, there are 164 degree-awarding higher education institutions in the UK. Prospective students certainly appear to have a lot of choice, but some universities have far tougher entrance requirements than others. The 24 members of the elite Russell Group typically specify higher A-level grades than the other 140 universities. Russell Group universities also have strong research departments, and consequently they attract more research funding and world-class professors than other institutions. Hence, demand for places on degree courses is intense. Not all university qualifications, however, have the same impact on a CV or application form, and despite a massive expansion of higher education over the last 60 years, 2 Russell Group universities still have more kudos than the others. Oxford and Cambridge, collectively known as OXBRIDGE, have been centres of academic excellence since they were established way back in the Middle Ages. Over the centuries, they have produced countless prime ministers, presidents, Nobel Prize winners, authors, scientists, and other very high achievers. It's hard to say how many British people have an Oxbridge degree, but it's a tiny number compared to university graduates as a whole. In 2015, for example, there were 532,000 undergraduate admissions to all UK universities. Oxford and Cambridge together accounted for just 6,649. So what about the cabinet and the senior BBC journalists? Well, as noted in the previous section, 48 of the grand sample went to university. Of these, 39 or 81% attended a Russell Group university, compared to a mere 6% of the British population. On this basis, our politicians and journalists are evidently in a very select group. But that's not the end of the story. When compared with recent data for British 18-year-olds in terms of higher education destination, the cabinet and the senior BBC journalists are the elite of the elite. Whereas around 1.25% of British university entrants currently go up to Oxford or Cambridge, over half our combined samples are graduates of these two universities. It's impossible to say whether the educational experiences offered by Oxford and Cambridge are fundamentally and unequivocally superior to those at other institutions. Research from the Sutton Trust, however, has consistently shown that a degree from either university gives a person considerable advantage in the higher reaches of the job market, particularly in politics and the media. Of our 26 senior BBC journalists, 5 graduated from Cambridge and 7 are Oxford alumni. At 46%, the proportion of Oxbridge graduates might appear inordinately high, certainly when compared with the general public, but it's in the same space as the Sutton Trust data. In 2006, for example, it reported that 45 of the top 100 newspaper editors, columnists, broadcasters and executives went to Oxford or Cambridge, and later research revealed similar numbers. Our figure for the current cabinet is also in line with existing data. 8 cabinet members are Oxford alumni and 5 are Cambridge graduates, and together these 13 people account for 59% of the 22-strong sample. To put these numbers into perspective, if we insert the data for my research into the Sutton Trust league table of professions with the highest Oxbridge attendance, our 26 journalists are not far behind diplomats, and Boris Johnson's cabinet would be in second place behind senior judges. Basically, both our groups are deeply embedded in the upper reaches of the British establishment. Now, I'm certainly not the first person to suggest this. In fact, numerous authors and academics have highlighted the continued presence of a highly privileged, largely Oxbridge-educated elite that runs the country. And why is this a problem? Well, there's no doubt that Oxford and Cambridge provide exceptional education, nothing wrong with that, but graduates leave with more than just a degree certificate. They also benefit throughout their subsequent lives from social networks formed at university which include fellow Oxbridge graduates working in other elite occupations. Hence, it is argued, an overrepresentation of Oxbridge alumni in higher professions ensures a perpetuation of the class system, which places the agenda of the privileged few above that of the majority. This argument is strengthened when we look at the link between independent schooling and Oxbridge. In its most recent report, the Sutton Trust analysed what it calls the elite pipeline that connects private schools, Oxbridge and the higher professions. Central to its findings is this diagram. At first glance it might look confusing, but under closer inspection it is both fascinating and rather concerning. The left of the chart shows that these proportions of Britain's elite professions, as defined elsewhere in the report, attended independent, grammar and state comprehensive schools. The right-hand side of the chart shows the higher education destination of each of these groups, and the largest subgroup of the elite, at 17%, went to independent schools and Oxbridge. It's important to note here that paying tens of thousands of pounds in private school fees doesn't guarantee a place at Oxford or Cambridge, but the data suggests that it certainly helps. If Oxbridge admissions were proportionate to the numbers of children attending state and independent schools, just 7% would be privately educated. The actual figures are 45% at Oxford and 38% at Cambridge. Although these numbers have fallen in recent years, they show that privately educated children are still around 6 times more likely to go to Oxbridge than their state school peers. So, is there any evidence of this, the elite pipeline, in our samples? Well, as we found earlier, 62% of the BBC journalists went to independent school, and half of these continued the elite trajectory to Oxbridge. We also found that 19, or 73%, of cabinet members went to private school, and 10 of these, that's 45% of the cabinet, are also Oxbridge graduates. The elite pipeline, it seems, is alive and well at the BBC and in the upper echelons of the Conservative Party. There is, of course, no such thing as a lifelong passport to success, but it's apparent that a degree certificate from Oxford or Cambridge comes pretty close. And if you want one of those, it certainly helps to have gone to a private school, which, of course, is a whole lot easier if you have relatively wealthy parents. To fully understand the nature of someone's social interactions would require questionnaires, interviews, and maybe even an ethnographic study. It's clearly impossible to do this with our 52 strong sample, but we can get a rough idea of what type of people they tend to interact with by first looking at their career histories. After university, the BBC journalists typically went straight into the media, starting in junior positions and then working their way up. Some began their careers in other news organisations and then moved to the BBC. Others started in BBC Radio and then switched to BBC TV. The most striking characteristic, however, is continuity. There are occasional changes in BBC personnel, but we tend to see and hear the same people day after day, year after year. In fact, 12 of our journalists have been at the BBC for 30 years or more, and the average length of service is 28. There's much more variation in the career histories of the Cabinet. 12 current members worked in the professions. These include 5 lawyers, 2 accountants and 2 army officers. A further 7 were in business, 2 are former journalists and 4 worked in political research and public relations. As you might expect from a group of graduates, not one of our grand sample left university and pursued what might be called a working class profession. So, unlike many British people, they have probably never had to worry about feeding the family or paying the bills. It's also doubtful if they've ever had to survive on state benefits. What's more, not one person has first-hand experience of the health or education sectors. In fact, public sector positions are totally absent. There are no former teachers, lecturers, social workers, doctors, nurses, or any caring profession. There are also no scientists, engineers, IT workers, and no sign of any involvement in manufacturing industry. Also, perhaps surprisingly for a political party that prides itself in being a pro-enterprise, there is scant sign of entrepreneurial activity. Based on what we know about the educational and career histories of our politicians and journalists, what type of people do you think they've mixed with and possibly even married? Well, the answer is surprisingly simple. People like themselves. Whatever our occupation, we often socialise with colleagues and other people of the same socio-economic group. Before internet dating, people often met through work, so it's no surprise that politicians and journalists tend to have partners in middle-class occupations. I found the partner occupations of 16 BBC journalists in orange and 9 cabinet members in blue. The most common category is business. 8 work as consultants, executives and in other commercial roles. Business is the top category for the BBC, closely followed by the media, with 3 of our sample married to fellow journalists. The third most common category is the professions, thanks to the high incidence of cabinet member spouses. 2 partners work in politics, and then there are 4 whose occupations don't fit easily elsewhere. As with parental occupation in part 1 of this video, we only have information for about half the grand sample. So again, we can't make bold pronouncements. It is apparent, however, that professions, business and the media dominate. What's more, there is significant overlap between the politicians and journalists. They tend to intermarry within the same socio-economic groups. And why is all this relevant? Well, forget for a moment the current occupations of the politicians. Go back to their previous careers and put them at a social event, a dinner party for example, and think about what lawyers, accountants, right-wing political researchers and people who work in the City of London would talk about. Then add the partners of these people and the senior BBC journalists and their partners. Pretty much everyone at the dinner party is university educated and has worked in well-paid middle-class occupations for their whole lives. What do you think this bunch of people would discuss over dinner? What would be their chosen topics of conversation? We can only speculate about such things, but given the largely middle-class occupations of their parents, the high incidence of private schooling and Oxbridge educations, and their relatively comfortable lives since university, it is debatable if they would be preoccupied with the same day-to-day issues faced by the 6 out of 10 British people who identify as working class. By looking at the politicians' and journalists' career histories and the occupations of their partners, we now have a rough sketch of their social interactions throughout their lives. The evidence suggests that they tend to mix with and marry other middle-class people, typically in the professions, business, media and politics. Conversely, there is little, if any, evidence that the Cabinet and the journalist have spent any significant time with the other half of the British population who are not middle class. But what about in their current professional lives? Well, you would hope that senior BBC journalists spend plenty of time talking to a wide range of British people in the course of their reporting. After all, we pay their wages through the licence fee, and the BBC has an obligation to understand and represent the interests of the general public. However, and this might horrify senior BBC journalists, academic research has consistently and emphatically shown that journalists habitually gravitate to other members of Britain's elite in the course of their work. Actually, this shouldn't come as a surprise. Nick Robinson's quote from part 1 of this video, "My job is to report on what those in power are thinking and doing," is a neat summary of the research in this area. Occasionally, during election campaigns and public debate programmes like Question Time, senior BBC journalists canvass the thoughts of the British public, but generally they spend most of their time speaking to politicians, business people and people in other elite occupations. What's more, their work usually keeps them in London. Although the capital is the centre of economic, political and cultural power, it's important to remember that 73% of the British population live outside the southeast of England. Because of the nature of their primary jobs as constituency MPs, the Cabinet members probably spend more time interacting directly with the British public than the journalists. Typically, they spend half their working lives in Westminster and the other half in their own constituencies, meeting a wide range of people in the process and helping them deal with their problems. It's important to note, however, that even though the Conservative Party made inroads into traditionally working class areas of the Midlands and Northern England at the 2019 general election, most of its MPs still represent relatively rich constituencies in the southern part of Britain. And the same is true for the Cabinet. 2 have seats in Scotland, 1 represents a Welsh constituency, there are 2 in the north and 4 in the Midlands. 2/3 of Cabinet members, however, are MPs in southern England. Like the senior BBC journalists, this is where they do their work and live, so their direct interactions with people in other parts of the nation, for example inner cities and post-industrial northern towns, is inevitably limited. Perhaps the most graphic indication of the distance between our politicians and journalists and the great British public is income. You would expect these 52 people to earn relatively high salaries. After all, they have considerable experience, responsibility and power. But it's important to remember that not only do we pay their wages, they also represent the interests of all British people, and ideally they should have experiential knowledge of how we live. According to the Office of National Statistics, the median pre-tax salary for a full-time employee in the UK is just over £30,000 a year. So if you earn more than that, you're doing relatively well, and you'll be pleased to know that university teachers are in the upper half of the British income table. £40,000 a year is typical for a senior lecturer. A standard MP at Westminster earns twice as much, £82,000. And the 26 Cabinet members are paid £142,000. That's almost 5 times more than the average Briton. What about our journalists? Well, the BBC now publishes the salaries of employees who earn more than £150,000 a year, and 19 of our sample are in this category. Every one of these BBC employees earns at least as much as the Cabinet members, and one is paid almost £500,000 a year. The average annual salary of our BBC sample is £245,000 a year, which is over 8 times more than the average Briton. It's important to note here that these figures are minima. MPs have generous expense allowances and some have second jobs, directorships and other private income. Many prominent journalists also earn extra money from secondary gigs, for example writing and public speaking. Also, when you consider that most have been earning higher than average salaries for several decades, their pension funds are probably in good shape and they can confidently look forward to comfortable retirements. And in the unlikely event that the politicians or journalists lose their jobs, another glance at partner occupations is enough to confirm that the household income will probably still remain above the national average. Before I amalgamate the evidence and offer some conclusions, I want to look at two elements of a person's social constitution that I have conspicuously not yet addressed. When people talk about diversity, gender and ethnicity are invariably placed ahead of all other measurements. In fact, they are often the only measurements. Both are very important indicators of how representative a group of people are of a broader population. And politicians, public bodies like universities and the BBC, and academics rightly spend a lot of time monitoring progress towards greater inclusivity. So, let's look at how our samples perform. In terms of gender, the national proportions are slightly in favour of females, 51 to 49%. But to keep it simple, let's assume that if the Cabinet and BBC journalists were faithful reflections of the British population, each group would include equal numbers of men and women. In reality, in both cases, men outnumber women by more than 2 to 1. Clearly, neither group represents this element of Britain's social constitution. In terms of ethnicity, an appropriate benchmark is the 2011 National Census data that puts the proportion of white people in England and Wales at 86%. You'll notice here, incidentally, that I have used the common abbreviation BAME to denote British people with black, Asian and minority ethnic heritage. The Cabinet has 4 members in this group and the BBC sample has 6, giving respective proportions of 15% and 23%. By this measurement, the Cabinet almost perfectly reflects the ethnic constitution of England and Wales, and the BBC exceeds the benchmark by 8 points. This is undoubtedly positive, and to be fair to the BBC for a moment, it has made considerable improvements in ethnic diversity in recent years, certainly in terms of the faces we see on TV and the owners of the voices we hear on the radio. This is evident in our own sample, in which the 3 most recent BBC recruits all have Asian ancestry. It's been a similar story with the Conservative Party, which has traditionally attracted supporters from the white British population. Now there are 22 Conservative ethnic minority MPs in the House of Commons, a number that would have been unthinkable under Margaret Thatcher or John Major's government. Progress has certainly been made, but, and it's a major but, when we look closer at the ethnic minority Britons in our samples, it's apparent that their life experiences are far removed from the majority. Indeed, these 10 journalists and politicians are a very close match to the white members of their respective groups. Again, parental occupations suggest that they tend to come from middle-class families. 7 out of the 10 attended independent school, the same number went to a Russell Group university, and 40% are Oxbridge graduates. So although the headline figures for ethnic diversity might appear encouraging, they obscure another form of institutional exclusion, namely against working class Britons of all ethnicities. The same is unfortunately true in terms of gender. That concludes part 2. At some point in the relatively near future, I will post a final instalment that ties my findings together and offers some conclusions. In the meantime, give us a like, spread the word, and stay at home.